The first sound she heard was fire, not the roar of it, not the hungry, consuming kind that announces itself with drama. This was the quiet kind, the patient kind, the kind that has already done its work and is simply finishing what it started. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. She did not know, in those first few seconds, what her name was, where she had been going, or why the sky above her was the color of ash and green at the same time. She only knew the sound of fire. And then, slowly, everything else. When she pushed herself up, her palms sank into wet earth. Her dress, the red one she had chosen deliberately that morning because her mother always said red was the color of women who understood rooms, was torn from her left shoulder to her hip. There was blood on her arm that had already dried. Her ears were ringing with a frequency she would later describe as the sound of something being permanently removed from the world. She turned her head, and she saw it. What was left of the plane? The tail section had separated almost cleanly, and it rested against a wall of jungle like something abandoned. The main fuselage was cracked open like an egg along the midsection, and from one of the wounds in its belly, a low orange flame was still eating. The Pacific Air logo on the side of the aircraft was partially visible, the letters uneven now, one side melted soft. She read those letters the way you read something in a dream, understanding the words, but not yet their meaning. She called out 3 names. She called for her brother Whitmore first, because he had been sitting closest to her. Then for her father's attorney, a man named Calder, who had organized the trip. Then for the co-pilot, whose name she had never learned and felt guilty about in that moment, standing in the mud, bleeding quietly. No one answered any of her calls. She walked to the wreckage. She checked every section she could reach. The cockpit had not survived the nose impact. She understood what that meant without going further. She found Calder near the front of the cabin. She did not look long. She was the only living person on that island. She believed that for a very long time. She believed it was an accident for even longer. Her name is Elara Vance. She is 44 years old, and what you just watched is not where this story begins. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Vance family had been in Oregon since before Oregon was a state. That sentence sounds like pride because that is exactly how Elara herded her entire childhood, delivered at dinner tables and at the edges of hunting land and at family gatherings where the oldest men in the room said it the way other people say grace. It was meant to inspire reverence. What it did not invite you to do was ask what the Vances had actually been doing in Oregon before it was a state, and what had been in their way. Elara's great-great-grandfather, a man named Corbett Vance, came west from Tennessee in 1849 with 2 things, a land claim and a willingness to do what quieter men would not. He built the family's first estate on 800 acres of high grassland in the Willamette Valley and acquired the next 400 through methods the family's official history called shrewd negotiation. His son extended the land. His grandson layered oil money on top of it. By the time Elara's father, Harlan Vance, inherited the estate, the Vance name in the Pacific Northwest was the kind of name that ended conversations rather than started them. Not because people feared it exactly, because people understood, without anyone explaining it, that the Vance family had never once been on the wrong side of a consequence. Elara grew up inside that name the way you grow up inside a house with no windows. She had 2 brothers. Whitmore was the eldest, being prepared from boyhood to inherit everything Harlan had built. He had their father's precision, their father's patience, and, Elara would later understand, their father's particular comfort with what the family privately called necessary actions. The younger brother, a man named Soren, had left the family years earlier under circumstances discussed only as a disappointment. Elara had always assumed it was weakness. She would revise that assumption completely before this was over. She had built a life outside the estate, a practice as a restoration architect in Portland, a reputation for being capable, self-possessed, and slightly difficult to fully read. She had spent 20 years reading damaged structures, understanding what had failed and why, and what could be salvaged. She was good at it because she had grown up in a family that required you to read damage carefully and say nothing about what you found. 3 months before the flight, she had been sorting through old storage at the family estate during a routine visit and found, in a box of her grandmother's documents, a folder that should not have existed. Legal records detailing a series of land transfers in the 1960s and 70s accomplished through the systematic intimidation and legal erasure of indigenous land claims. Affidavits that had been forged. A county official who had been purchased rather than persuaded. And a personal letter, and signed, that discussed the importance of what it called permanent solutions to inheritance complications. She had not fully understood that letter then. She had photographed the documents with her phone, replaced the folder carefully, and said nothing to anyone. She told herself she needed time to think. She told herself she would know what to do with it when the time was right. This was what the family had trained her to do. Stay quiet. Keep the peace. Ask no difficult questions at the wrong moment. What she did not know was that the estate's storage wing had been under camera surveillance for years. Elara Vance, a man who had spent 7 decades making sure that nothing on his property escaped his awareness, reviewed the security footage 3 days after her visit. He watched his daughter open that folder. He watched her read. He watched her photograph every page. He watched her replace the folder and leave the room with the stillness of someone who had just learned something they were not supposed to know. He made a single phone call to Whitmore that same evening. The conversation was short. It did not need to be long. These were men who had been raised on the same understanding that complications, left unmanaged, became catastrophes. And Elara, without knowing it, had just become a complication. Whitmore brought their mother, Celeste, into the decision within the week. Celeste Vance was a woman who had spent 50 years standing beside Harlan without once flinching at the cost of that position, and she did not flinch now. She said only that it needed to be clean, that there could be no suggestion of anything other than tragedy, and that the family would grieve publicly and completely. She asked no further questions because she had never needed the details. She only needed the outcome. Soren, the younger brother, was not consulted. He had been removed from the family's inner circle years earlier precisely because, unlike the rest of them, he had a conscience that occasionally inconvenienced his loyalty. That inconvenience had made him, in Harlan's estimation, a liability. In this matter, he was simply left out. The flight was organized 2 weeks after Harlan's phone call to Whitmore. Calder, the family attorney, was told only that there were estate documents requiring signatures and that the charter was a practical convenience. Calder knew the family's history in broad strokes, the way all attorneys who serve powerful families know things in broad strokes, enough to be useful, not enough to be dangerous. He did not know what the flight was for. He simply boarded it, as he always did, because Elara Vance asked him to, and because that was what 30 years of loyalty looked like. The call from Whitmore to Elara came in the first week of October. He said their father was aging. He said it would be one weekend. He said the family's private charter would fly them up together. He said he had missed her. Elara said yes. She always said yes to Whitmore. This was one of the things she would think about during the long nights on the island, turning it over slowly, the way you turn a stone found in an unexpected place, not sure yet whether it is ordinary or not. The morning of the flight, she wore the red dress. Calder was already at the private terminal when she arrived, efficient and cordial as always. Whitmore was there too, moving through the terminal with the easy authority of a man entirely in control of his surroundings. He embraced her at the gate. He asked about her work. He was warm in the particular way he had always been warm with her, and she had spent enough years inside that warmth that she could not yet see it for what it was. They boarded together. The pilots introduced themselves. The co-pilot smiled and said it was a beautiful morning for flying. She agreed. And then, just before the aircraft taxied, Whitmore appeared at the cabin door with his phone pressed to his ear and an apologetic expression on his face. He said there was a call he could not defer, a matter with the Portland office that needed him on the ground. He said he would fly up separately that evening and meet them there. He squeezed Elara's shoulder as he passed her seat. She barely looked up. She thought nothing of it. She watched him descend the boarding stairs through the oval window without a second thought, because this was Whitmore, and Whitmore always had urgent calls, and she had spent 44 years not thinking twice about anything he did. The plane lifted. She looked out the window and watched Portland grow small beneath cloud cover. She fell asleep somewhere over the coast. She did not wake up until the mud. The first sound she heard was fire, not the roar of it, not the hungry, consuming kind that announces itself with drama. This was the quiet kind. The patient kind. The kind that has already done its work and is simply finishing what it started. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. She did not know, in those first few seconds, what her name was, where she had been going, or why the sky above her was the color of ash and green at the same time. She only knew the sound of fire. And then, slowly, everything else. When she pushed herself up, her palms sank into wet earth. Her dress, the red one she had chosen deliberately that morning because her mother always said red was the color of women who understood rooms, was torn from her left shoulder to her hip. There was blood on her arm that had already dried. Her ears were ringing with a frequency she would later describe as the sound of something being permanently removed from the world. She turned her head, and she saw it. What was left of the plane? The tail section had separated almost cleanly, and it rested against a wall of jungle like something abandoned. The main fuselage was cracked open like an egg along the midsection, and from one of the wounds in its belly, a low orange flame was still eating. The Pacific Air logo on the side of the aircraft was partially visible, the letters uneven now, one side melted soft. She read those letters the way you read something in a dream, understanding the words, but not yet their meaning. She called out 3 names. She called for her brother Whitmore first, because he had been sitting closest to her. Then for her father's attorney, a man named Calder, who had organized the trip. Then for the co-pilot, whose name she had never learned and felt guilty about in that moment, standing in the mud, bleeding quietly. No one answered any of her calls. She walked to the wreckage. She checked every section she could reach. The cockpit had not survived the nose impact. She understood what that meant without going further. She found Calder near the front of the cabin. She did not look long. Elara Vance was the only living person on that island. She believed that for a very long time. She believed it was an accident for even longer. She gave herself 1 full day to grieve, 1 day to cry, to shake, to sit against the cold metal of the broken fuselage and feel entirely at the mercy of everything. She thought if she did not allow it, it would find her later at a worse moment. So she allowed it. She cried for Calder, who had not known what he was walking into. She cried for the pilots. She did not cry for Whitmore because she could not find him in the wreckage, and some part of her was still holding the possibility that he had never been on the plane at all, that she had simply misremembered his departure in the chaos. She would understand that instinct later. She would understand that her mind had already begun to work on the truth before she was ready to face it. On the second day, she started working. She was a restoration architect. She applied that discipline to the island the way she applied it to anything broken. First, a full assessment. She walked the crash site in expanding circles, cataloging what she had. The fuselage provided shelter and material. She found sealed food from the galley, a first aid kit, and a survival bag in the cargo hold that contained items so specific and well-chosen she assumed it was standard equipment. A water filtration straw, emergency rations, a compact multi-tool, a foil blanket. She noted faintly that it was an unusually well-stocked bag, better stocked than any charter flight she had ever taken before. She filed that thought and kept moving. The island was not large. 4 days of careful walking gave her its general shape, a rough oval perhaps 3 miles at its longest point, dense jungle interior, a rocky shoreline broken in 2 places by small beaches. Clean water came from streams running down from the elevated center. She was not going to die of thirst or exposure. She began building. She made her camp in the tail section, reinforced it against the rain, learned which plants were safe, and established a daily routine, because routine is the architecture of sanity, and she understood architecture. On the 18th day, she found the cache. It was buried at the base of a distinctive tree on the northern end of the island, covered by a flat stone placed too deliberately to be natural. Inside a waterproof container sat a compact radio, printed coordinates, 3 days of rations, and a handwritten note. The note said only this: confirm silence. 7 days. She sat with that container for a long time. The survival bag in the cargo hold. Whitmore stepping off the plane at the last moment. The folder in her grandmother's box. The forged affidavits. The purchased official. The letter about permanent solutions to inheritance complications. One by one, each piece she had been carrying separately came together in the space of about 30 seconds, and when they finished assembling themselves, there was no confusion left. Only a very cold and very complete understanding. The crash had not been an accident. The island had been chosen in advance. The survival bag had been placed there to keep her alive long enough for the plan to work cleanly, long enough for the official story of a tragic accident to settle into place without a body creating complications, after which someone would come to close the account. She had been an inheritance complication, and her family had decided, together, on a permanent solution. She turned the radio over in her hands. She did not turn it on. Not yet. She waited 6 weeks before she touched it again. 6 weeks during which she became someone the Portland version of herself would not have immediately recognized. She learned the island the way her ancestors had once claimed to learn land, though she was learning it for entirely different reasons. She knew every trail, every hiding place, every sight line from the high center. She knew where you could move without being seen and where you could not. She knew which sections of shoreline could take a small boat and which could not. She found 3 other signs of prior human presence. A cleared area on the southern beach too regular to be natural, 2 iron stakes driven into coastal rock, and a rusted pulley system on a tree near the eastern shore that still functioned. Someone had used this island before. Someone had known it well enough to prepare it. This had all been arranged with the kind of patience that only comes from people who have been making things disappear for generations. She turned the radio on one evening at the coordinates time the note had referenced. She did not transmit. She listened. What she heard was a brief, professional exchange between 2 voices checking a status she understood immediately. She recognized one of them. She had heard it at every family dinner for 44 years. She had heard it say she was loved. She had heard it say she was trusted. She had heard it call her the quiet one, the loyal one, the one who never made things difficult. Whitmore's voice, unhurried and precise, asking whether there had been any sign of life from the island. The other voice, a man she did not recognize, telling him there had not. Whitmore saying to give it 2 more weeks, and then send the team to confirm and recover the bag. 2 more weeks, and then send the team. She did not cry when she heard it. She had already done that. She turned the radio off. She sat looking at the fire she had built and thought about Corbett Vance, who had come west with a land claim and a willingness to do what quieter men would not. She thought about her father reviewing camera footage in the dark of his study. She thought about her mother saying it needed to be clean. She thought about how every predator she had encountered in her life, whether in a courtroom or at a dinner table, carried one shared vulnerability. They believed that what they had removed from the board stayed removed. She started preparing for the day they came to confirm she had. The recovery team arrived on a Tuesday, 11 weeks and 4 days after the crash. Whitmore had contracted them through a private security firm the family had used for decades for matters that required discretion rather than documentation. 3 men, none of them strangers to this kind of work, arriving by small boat to the southern beach, the cleared landing point she had identified weeks earlier. She watched them from the tree line for 2 hours before she moved. They carried equipment for a search and recovery, which in this context meant they were not looking for a survivor. They were confirming an absence and retrieving the radio and anything else that connected the island to the family's arrangements. What happened over the next 36 hours is not something that narrates cleanly. What I will tell you is that Elara used the island the way 11 weeks had prepared her to use it. She used the terrain. She used the silence she had learned. She used patience, which is the most dangerous quality a person can develop in isolation, because patience without sentiment is simply precision with unlimited time. 2 of the 3 men left the island without completing their mission. The third left without the equipment they had brought. Elara kept it. She found the boat considerably more useful than anything remaining at the crash site. She used it to reach the nearest coastal marker off the Washington coast. From there, she made one call. Not to law enforcement. Not to family. To a journalist in Portland named Deacon Marsh, who had spent 6 years investigating land rights violations in the Pacific Northwest, and who had sent a letter to the Vance estate 18 months earlier that had been intercepted and never answered. She had read about Deacon in a legal journal 2 years before the crash and had thought, in the abstract way you think about things you believe will never be personally necessary, that he seemed like exactly the kind of man who could not be bought. She told him her name. She told him she had been away. She told him she had documents she thought he would find very interesting and that she had reason to believe his earlier inquiry into the Vance family had been deliberately suppressed. Deacon Marsh called her back within the hour. The story broke on a Thursday morning in February, 14 weeks after the plane went down. By the time Harlan Vance's attorneys had prepared a response, 11 of the family's financial holdings had already been frozen pending investigation. By the time Whitmore held his first press conference calling the claims unfounded, 3 former county officials had already given preliminary interviews to federal investigators. The photographs Elara had taken in that storage room, copies of which she had mailed to Deacon from a post office in Astoria the morning she returned to the mainland, were the kind of documents that do not require interpretation. They only require reading. She watched the coverage from a city she did not disclose. She watched Whitmore on camera, composed and lawyered, precisely the man she had always known him to be. She watched him say her name with grief in his voice. She watched him call her death a tragedy the family was still processing. She watched his face when a reporter asked directly whether the crash had been investigated for mechanical failure, and he said yes, fully, and that the family had been personally assured of one thing. He said it was an accident. She turned the television off and sat in the quiet. And then she got up, made coffee, and stood at the window of an apartment rented under a name that was not yet hers, looking out at a street that did not know her, feeling for the first time in 44 years entirely and precisely like herself. Soren, the brother the family had written off years earlier as a disappointment, had been located by Deacon Marsh in the 3rd month of the investigation, living quietly in Bend, Oregon. He had left the family not out of weakness, as Elara had always assumed, but because he had understood years before she did what the family actually was and had decided he would not be part of it. When federal investigators came to him, he did not ask for immunity. He simply sat down and told them everything he knew, which turned out to be considerably more than the family had ever realized he had retained. His deposition ran to 47 pages. Celeste Vance retained her composure through the early proceedings with the discipline of a woman who had spent 50 years perfecting the performance of it. She said very little publicly. She would say even less as the proceedings continued, on the advice of counsel, and then on the advice of more expensive counsel, and eventually in complete silence. Harlan Vance died before the final proceedings concluded. His attorneys released a statement describing a man of integrity and community. The statement was published on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, it had been largely displaced in the news cycle by a federal filing that detailed, in precise bureaucratic language, the full scope of what the Vance family had built and what it had cost. Whitmore is currently the subject of federal charges that his attorneys describe as vigorously contested. The estate was liquidated through a legal settlement described in Pacific Northwest newspapers as unprecedented. The land, all of it, went back. Elara Vance practices restoration architecture in a city she has not made public. She is, by all accounts, very good at it. She always was. The difference now is that she is no longer doing it inside a house with no windows. She knows exactly what she can see from where she stands, and she is not quiet about any of it. If you stayed until the end, thank you. More stories from Breach and Balance are already on your screen. Click one now, and if you have not subscribed yet, do not miss what is coming next. See you there.